Hello and a very warm welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Sanam Shantier. Coming up on our programme this week, the US is set to designate Yemen's Houthi rebels a terrorist group, this amid rising tensions with Iran. We'll be joined by Gabriel Nerona, who was working on communications with Iran at the US State Department. He was dismissed following a rare public criticism of Donald Trump. Plus, Lebanon plans an 11-day, 24-hour curfew as overwhelmed hospitals turn away coronavirus patients. We start with the outgoing US administration, which is set to designate Yemen's Houthi rebels as a foreign terrorist organization. This years into a civil conflict that has plunged the country into a humanitarian crisis. On one side, we have the Saudi-backed government, and on the other, the Houthi forces who are supported by Iran. Yinka Ayotada brings us this report.
Houthi rebels in Yemen are set to join ISIS and Al-Qaeda on the US's list of foreign terrorist organizations. This in a bid to hold the group accountable for what US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says are terrorist acts, including cross-border attacks threatening civilian populations, infrastructure, and commercial shipping. In response to the designation, Mohammed Ali al-Houthi, leader of the rebels, tweeted, "America is the source of terrorism. The policy of the Trump administration and its behavior is terrorist. It does not matter to the Yemeni people which classification stems from the Trump administration, as it is a true partner in killing and starving the Yemeni people." The Houthi rebels have been at war with the Saudi-backed government in Yemen for the last 6 years. Since the start of their insurgency, they have gained control of the capital Sana'a and vast territories in the north of the country. The group receives military assistance from Iran, a country that's engaged in a proxy war with Saudi Arabia for influence in the Arabian Peninsula. The conflict is said to have sparked the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with more than 112,000 people dead and millions on the brink of famine. Human rights groups say the move will only worsen the situation.
And this is going to make it much more difficult for humanitarian groups to try to offer humanitarian aid in that area that is controlled by the Houthis. And the Houthis control a large area. In addition to Sana'a, they also control the port of Hudaida, where most of the humanitarian aid arrives at.
With just days till the end of the Trump administration, the measure solidifies the US's hardline approach to Iran, which the president is trying to force Joe Biden to maintain.
Now it's time for this week's guest on Middle East Matters. I'd like to welcome Gabriel Nerona to the programme, who was working on communications with Iran at the US State Department until several days ago. He was dismissed by the White House after tweeting that Donald Trump is, quote, unfit for office. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Gabriel, thanks so much for being with us. Sorry to hear that you were fired because of your tweets. Staying on that subject, were there ever any standards in place that you had to uphold when communicating about Iran, which was the core of your work at the State Department?
Well, during my time at the State Department, I was the lead for developing the State Department's official communications with Iran, which all went through the Secretary and were often communicated by him. I would sometimes write my personal opinions on my personal Twitter account on Iran, often to explain to the American people, Iranians, and those around the world the threat that was posed by Iran. But those were my personal opinions.
So you express your personal opinions, and the reason that I want to bring this up is because I went through some of your tweets this morning, and you may not like the sound of this, but in some ways, to me, it appeared that, like Donald Trump, you're using this platform to attack media outlets and individuals whose work you didn't agree with. I'll give you 2 examples that our viewers will see in the program. An attack against that responsible statecraft, and also a journalist who'd written about the possibility of war with Iran.
I think for someone who lives in the West and enjoys its privileges, it's abhorrent to attack human rights activists in Iran who have been subject to death threats. Their siblings have been arrested on their behalf. And so for someone in the West to attack those human rights activists and demean their credibility is, I think, an abhorrent abuse of the privileges and rights we enjoy here in the West. And it's not the way we should use our freedom of expression. I think it's very similar to the rights of the politicians now who are speaking out Some of them, unfortunately, abused their rights of expression and fomented the mob that attacked the Capitol. In both cases, yes, they have rights, but they must be responsible for their use of their language and understand that this has real impacts on human lives. People
Absolutely,
can
Gabrielle.
die.
I can't agree with you more, but sorry to interrupt you there. The reason I bring up these two particular tweets is because I read the pieces that you address, and they have nothing to do with attacking human rights in Iran. And indeed, you do make certain allegations. If you had proof at some point that, let's say, an organization like Responsible Statecraft, which is a publication of the Quincy Institute, is funded by the Iranian regime, why not present that to us instead of resorting to trolling? Or when you attack the journalist for penning a, quote, ridiculous piece about the possibility of war with Iran, you know, the big question from my perspective as a journalist is, surely there's a reason that tens of articles have been written on this subject by the likes of The Guardian, Al Jazeera, CNN, the list really goes on, I'll stop there. But surely it's because of the very unpredictable nature of Donald Trump, which led to you being fired from the State Department, him as a leader, that's led to the school of thought that we're seeing today. And we've also had sources, a former CIA official, veteran whistleblower saying that there may be war. So why attack those stances that you personally don't agree with?
Well, because I think there's a double standard where there are not these voices who have a large influence and a large platform are, in my view, misleading the public. They are presenting an inflated view of the risk. There has not been war in the Middle East started by the United States at all in the last 4 years. We have been extremely reluctant to use military force. We've had incredible great restraint. And that's not being reported accurately. So I think
why not have dialogue? Why not create a safe space to have dialogue? Because for people like me who've been covering Iran for well over a decade, it seems like the ambiance itself has changed. We're not used to seeing this sort of aggressive language, certainly by a US government official on social media. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I really didn't experience anything like this, certainly prior to Donald Trump taking the helm in the United States 4 years ago.
Well, that's not true. We've had many forums. We do lots of engagements with journalists, with think tanks, in open forums. We've done public question and answer sessions. We're more than happy to do that. But when there's a misleading media narrative, we'll correct it and we'll stand up.
And that's my point. Why not correct it instead of engaging in really aggressive language? Because I think surely after Trump leaves, we'd all look back and say, we had enough of that aggressive language, bullying, harassment. Let's engage in conversations.
I think if you read the totality of my tweets, and you'll see a lot of very substantive engagement into the argument, into the rhetoric, and explaining just why these arguments are wrong. But it's also important for viewers to understand just how dangerous a lot of these narratives are that people create, and it plays right into the hands of the Iranian regime. That's the worrying thing, that these people who have platforms aren't standing up for human rights. They're attacking human rights dissidents. They're not standing up. They're not trying to.
If I remember correctly, The Guardian has written actually a plethora of pieces on human rights in Iran, or lack thereof. Listen, Gabrielle, I do want to focus on some of the more positive work that you did. You really did engage with Iranians both in and out of the country using different platforms. Tell us a little bit about that very briefly, if you can.
Sure. So I manage the United States and Farsi platforms. Over the last year, we've gained well over 1 million followers. We have over 2 million Iranian followers. And our mission is to tell them the real story about the United States. The Iranian regime wants to portray us as the great Satan. We aren't people that hate the Iranian people. We love the Iranian people. We wish the best for them. We want their freedom, their ability to be free and to be able to speak out against their regime. We support their protests. And we receive thousands of messages from the Iranian people thanking us and expressing their views that the United States is not their enemy. The people of the United States and the people of Iran are great friends. And we look forward to the day when our two peoples can be friends again, and so our governments can as well.
Indeed. Gabrielle Noronha, I'd like to thank you very much for being with us here on Middle East Matters. Now, Now to coronavirus-related news in the region. Over the recent days, a surge in cases in Lebanon has been overwhelming hospitals, and so authorities have tightened a nationwide lockdown, including an 11-day, 24-hour curfew. France 24's Julia Kim has the story.
Drastic measures for a drastic situation. From Thursday, Lebanon's 6 million inhabitants will be confined to their homes for 11 days, with no exceptions, not even for buying food, taking exercise, or walking the dog. Supermarkets will remain open for delivery, but panicked shoppers have already emptied the shelves.
We came to buy bread, and there's not even a crumb left. So now we're going to the bakery because we heard that bakeries won't close.
A nationwide lockdown had been announced on January 7th, with a nighttime curfew from 6 p.m. But cases have continued to climb, with 5,000 new infections per day.
We didn't think that we would reach this point. We thought that the coronavirus out there was different to what we have here. Now we're at the heart of the crisis.
Hospitals are saturated. Over the past week, health workers have been sounding the alarm, saying their facilities have reached capacity.
Sometimes we don't have the space and the patients have to wait for hours, whether they be serious cases or not. The hospitals have given everything they can.
The health crisis comes on the back of the country's worst economic recession in decades, with record unemployment and soaring debt making recovery look like a very distant prospect.
We end with images of the first Mass in 5 decades held at the St. John the Baptist Chapel in the West Bank. Now, this is a site where Jesus is believed to have been baptized. The event, which had to be altered due to COVID-19 restrictions, comes after more than 1,000 landmines were cleared in the area. The cost of the demining project, $1.15 million. However, it has to be said that landmines still do speckle many parts of this territory. Well, that's it from us. Thank you for watching Middle East Matters.